Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, Robbie, there is an ongoing debate about whether or not the murder of Tyre Nichols has anything to do with white supremacy. The fact that 5 black officers were involved has led some to believe that race couldn't have had anything to do with it. And the fact that at least one white officer was involved but largely omitted from the narrative proves to others that it absolutely did. Regardless of where you land on that issue, it is clear to me that there's something clumsy about the way Americans have been talking about racial prejudice over the last 10 years or so. As Americans have become more comfortable with conceptual ideas like white supremacy, racial bias, and structural racism, those concepts have, at times, been overapplied to the point of farce. What were once academically rooted and narrowly defined ideas have leaked through the realm of HR and diversity and inclusion professionals who have too often have too little rigorous experience with the academic terms they use beyond maybe a sociology class they once took sophomore year. And that's how, in some narrow context, the idea of, let's say, racial privilege, the idea that stereotypes and presumptions can advantage some people depending on their identity or disadvantage others, has in some narrow cases been perverted into the idea that white people, even white children, are morally culpable for the actions of their forefathers. It's how academic critiques of the value we place on traits like timeliness became clumsy inclusiveness guides that warn that punishing employees for tardiness is racism. Writer and public intellectual Thomas Chatterton Williams tackled this subject in an article published in The Atlantic yesterday. In it, he argued that the term white supremacy in particular has been overapplied in a way that is, quote, a much vague and more totalizing concept that includes such innocuous practices as punctuality. He argued that white supremacy used to refer to the belief encoded in both custom and law that white people sit at the top of a biological racial hierarchy and that they must remain there. But to claim that Tyre Nichols' death at the hands of black cops and at least one white cop was a product of white supremacy, he says, is something unknowable. This expectedly made Thomas the target of a ton of online blowback, some of which I agree with, but I do want to credit more of this position than others might. First, I want to make it clear that I don't disagree with the argument that white supremacy played a role in Tyre Nichols' death. Though I personally would choose to use a term like structural racism instead for the sake of clarity and specificity. The reason is this: despite all the hand-wringing about how race is overtaught in schools, CRT, et cetera, most of us learned a pretty simple version of racism that was limited to interpersonal acts between two people, one white, one not, that expressed prejudice. That's what we think racism is. And the presence of 5 black cops, in this case, confuses that narrative for obvious reasons. And yet, those of us who benefited from the types of racial studies that are now being banned by certain authoritarian conservatives across the country have a broader understanding of what prejudice can look like and who can hold it. For example, murderers who kill white victims are 4 times more likely to get the death penalty regardless of the race of the perpetrator, leading some analysts to the conclusion that because ending white life is punished more severely, that white lives are valued more, at least by our criminal justice system. Some would argue that the disproportionate value for white life is taught to us through media and movies and fairy tales, and also via our policies, which treat low white birth rates as something to lament and high non-white birth rates as great replacement. And these are lessons easily internalized by anyone, including, of course, black cops. James Baldwin wrote 37 years ago that, quote, if you must call a policeman, for God's sake, try to make sure it's a white one. A black policeman could completely demolish you. He knew far more about you than a white policeman could, and you were without defenses before this black brother in uniform, whose entire reason for breathing seemed to be his hope to offer proof that, though he was black, he was not black like you. Although it may seem like a post hoc rationalization to attribute Tyre's death to white supremacy, I definitely see the argument. Still, I think at bottom, Thomas is right about there being something off about the way we talk about race today. The problem, I think, is rooted more in DEI tutorials taught by less than expert race professionals than academic disciplines like CRT. But there have been some documented instances of what I would describe as overreach. Lessons which veer from ideas like racial bias can advantage white people and disadvantage others, into ideas like white people are intrinsically bad. And I'm frustrated by those overreaches precisely because those outlier lessons have enabled an authoritarian pogrom against basic lessons in African American history. Yesterday on the show, we discussed a clip of a conversation between actor Bryan Cranston and comedian Bill Maher, in which the latter argued that the ban on CRT isn't really attacking the teaching of, say, basic history, that no one really has a problem with teaching basic history about slavery and the like. The only issue, of course, is overreach.
But critical race theory can mean it's just one of these catch-all terms. If you mean we should honestly teach our past, of course. If you mean more what the 1619 book says, which is that it's just the essence of America and that we are irredeemable, that's just wrong. It's not.
I mean,
okay.
yeah,
Right.
I agree with that. But even teaching our past and being honest and owning up to who we are as a country and the history of it.
Most schools are doing that. I mean, I'm sure there are ones in Texas that are not.
Look, in Florida, they want to do away with critical race theory, and a lot of other states.
Because sometimes it veers off into things that are really not appropriate in schools.
So how do you govern that?
If you're telling 5-year-olds that you're either an oppressor or someone who was oppressed, you're introducing ideas about race that are inappropriate for kids that age who can't understand it.
To the extent that some teacher somewhere is telling a child that they are an oppressor, I agree that that is wrong, assuming, of course, that that is taking place somewhere in America. But as often happens in both recent history and historically, narrow outlier or wedge issues are used to open a Pandora's box of authoritarian censorship. In Florida, Ron DeSantis has given up the pretense that his pogrom against learning about racism is really about protecting the kids. He's now trying to ban CRT or curriculum about diversity at public colleges altogether. Dozens of math textbooks have been banned in the state because they allegedly indoctrinate kids. An example of this indoctrination? Well, one book reviewer tasked with the censorship regime flagged a statement that said that the United States had not eradicated poverty or racism. Okay, the statement that got censored is that the United States has not eradicated poverty or racism. I'm not sure when that became a controversial statement. Maher repeated the line you heard just then, that conservatives have no issue talking about racism or real history, just the wacky CRT stuff. But the proof is in the pudding. Another flagged passage that got a book banned was a reference to the gender pay gap. The censor argued that acknowledging inequity made her feel inferior as a young woman, so better to censor the existence of inequity in the first place, I guess. Isn't that exactly the kind of snowflake behavior, trigger warnings in books that conservatives once parodied? While I do want to affirm that some excesses do exist, these excesses have been used to justify broad authoritarian censorship. Listen to Marjorie Taylor Greene here describe CRT. Again, an academic discipline much broader than narrow complaints about individual teachers who might say something offensive.
Can you tell me how much COVID cash went to CRT?
CRT?
Critical race theory in education. It's a racist curriculum used to teach children that somehow their white skin is not equal to black skin and other things in education.
Yeah. No, I do not know that, but I do know that there's provisions that the federal funds generally are not used, are supposed to be used for curriculum.
Oh.
That's a state.
Oh, Mr. Dodaro, I have to tell you, in Illinois, they received $5.1 billion at an elementary school there that used it for equity and diversity.
Now, MSNBC reported that this $5.1 billion funding claim is false. But are we really in a world where we're just calling everything we disagree with here racist? Isn't that what conservatives used to complain about with liberals? It seems clear that conservatives who have long sought to defund public education are in fact using the threat of CRT to drain money from already struggling public school budgets, undoing the public education system that once made America the envy of the world. If the issue is teachers telling kids that it's bad to be white, okay, well, why not ban teachers from telling kids it's bad to be white? If everyone agrees that it's good to learn about slavery and to have a holistic view of the founding fathers and what they did well and what they did poorly, why not narrowly tailor laws? Why not enact legislation that results in, why, instead of narrowly tailor laws, enact legislation that results in dozens of math books being banned in Florida, along with, by the way, the entire AP African American history class? Are we to believe that these authoritarian conservatives truly have no problem with the discussion of slavery when they use such an imprecise tool to address this problem? Is this not akin to saying there was some COVID misinformation on social media platforms, so it justifies banning entire accounts or entire subjects, that entire hashtag should be suppressed as a consequence? How can a person see authoritarian overreach in one scenario, but not in the other? I want to be clear, evidence of these overreaches in a primary school context, where I would agree they'd be most damaging, are fairly limited. On the other hand, evidence that teachers of all races regularly negatively stereotype Black students, place them in remedial classes, call the cops on them, and have them arrested is actually significant. And it's worth asking why the former is considered a national crisis by some conservatives, but the latter is all but ignored, including by Democratic politicians, despite Black Americans being their most loyal electoral constituency. Now, one last thing, it's worth asking what's gained by framing police violence as almost exclusively a Black issue, or one motivated primarily by white supremacy, rather than what I believe it is, which is an authoritarian desire to control a public via a militarized police state. I think it's important to recognize white supremacy. It's real and alive and well. You know, the Tree of Life synagogue murderer didn't randomly choose his victims. He shouted, "All Jews must die," before killing 11 and wounding 6. The Buffalo shooter, who killed 10 Black Americans at a grocery store last year, explicitly targeted Black people, writing in his manifesto, "I am simply a white man seeking to protect and serve my community, my people, my culture, and my race," and citing the Great Replacement theory. It would be absurd to deny the existence of racism and the special harm that targets of racism must endure. But it's also true that, like so many issues that disproportionately affect historically marginalized groups, the majority of people affected in America, because the demographic reality of this country, are in fact white. By pure numbers, police brutality touches more white people than Black people. Of the 1,060 civilians shot by the police in 2022, 220 were Black, 374 were white. 114 were Hispanic, and a number were race unknown. The disproportionate weight of police murders borne by Black Americans must be noted. It is relevant. It has had the effect of terrorizing a community, causing Black men in particular to panic in the face of routine traffic stops, and manifesting a cultural practice known as the talk, where Black parents explain to their children techniques to avoid violence at the hands of ostensible public servants, a talk given at painfully young ages. It's hard to imagine a world where you'd have to warn a 12-year-old that they might be perceived as a threat to an adult man, a cop with a gun. And yet, as we know, Tamir Rice is dead, and the officers who shot the little boy playing in the park seconds after pulling up on him in their cop car were not sanctioned in any way over the incident. This is a unique and specific racialized tragedy. But also tragic are the plurality of deaths at the hands of cops that affect white people. Deaths like the murder of Daniel Shaver, who was gunned down cruelly after being given contradictory orders by cops who had him lying supine in a hallway. Cross your legs, no kneel, no crawl, but don't put your hands down. The cop said he was reaching for his waist. What it looks like in the video is that he was trying to keep his shorts from falling down as he tried to obey orders. The tragedy of this event seems obvious to me, as does the tragedy of Tyre Nichols' murder. Tyre was also given contradictory instructions. Unlike Daniel, who had the cops called on him because he had a gun propped up and pointed outside his window, Tyre was completely unarmed and had no criminal record. He was slight, a mere 145 pounds due to his struggles, it seems, with Crohn's disease, and he was the father of a 4-year-old son. Is the case for police reform stronger when Shaver's story is told alongside Tyre's? If Americans are in fact less likely to support a social program or policy if it's perceived to benefit Blacks, does it disadvantage the cause itself to frame issues like police brutality through primarily the lens of racism? Is it more persuasive for interlocutors like Van Jones to argue that the police who killed Tyre Nichols were driven by racism, as opposed to arguing that the police represent an authoritarian power that could come for your sons and daughters too, no matter what your race is? Should both arguments be made? And are historically marginalized groups ultimately hurt by framing America's racial issues as intractable? If there's no curing racism, no curing America, no curing white people, why even try? Does that sort of Afro-pessimism that can be so compelling in an academic sphere serve to stymie progress when applied in a policy context? Does making police violence a Black issue insulate what is fundamentally a widely applied authoritarian regime from broader critique?
Well, you touched on a lot of things there, but I agree with that last point. I think I agree with the point you're making. I think I've said it before, that I do worry that giving police violence an explicitly racial framing makes the cause less appealing to conservatives or just independents, other people. And also, I think a lot of people just intuitively struggle to grasp the concept of what it means to be disproportionate.
Yeah.
Like, it is the case that Black people disproportionately suffer police violence, even though, because the vast majority of the country is white people, they're in raw numbers, there are more white people. This comes up in the mass shooting dialogue.
Yeah.
You see article after article about how all white shooters are disproportionately white males. It's white males, it's white males. If you look at the statistics, they're not disproportionately white males. It's just 70% of all people are white males. So you're going to have more in raw numbers, even if it's not.
It's not 70%. 70% of all people are white, but not white males.
White.
Men still have to reckon with
men, in fact, yes, there is a disproportionate. Most violence is both caused by men and are also the recipient of violence is men.
Sure, yeah. So, these are some difficult questions. I know I touched on a lot there, but, I think it's difficult to make this argument because I think the racialized aspect of crimes matter, right? If I choose to target you, to stalk you, to hurt you specifically because I'm out to get you, Robbie, certainly you wouldn't be indifferent to that, right? To be a random.
It would explain quite a lot of things, actually.
But in all seriousness, so it matters. It matters in terms of how we keep people safe and to have that background. At the same time, there's so many well-meaning, I think, Black interlocutors who make this case about how, well, white people don't care if a policy is Black. At the same time, they are distrustful of policies that are framed as anything other than pro-Black policies. What's your Black agenda? What specifically are you as a politician going to do for Black people? I think those are very reasonable questions to ask. But from a public policy perspective, when you look at this confusion that's happening right now around Tyre Nichols and whether the police could be acting at a racism, and you see all these conservatives saying, well, no, it's not racism. It's very bad, but it wasn't racism. Okay. Well, it's very, very bad. What do you attribute it to? And does this mean as a conservative, you're going to take more seriously the critique of the police force if it really just is about the police being bad? And
also the policies designed specifically to focus on the racial part of various aspects of the workplace and et cetera, the DEI stuff, tend to be the ones with the least legitimacy behind them, and also a difficulty in discerning in the data that they actually improved things. A lot of people, including Jesse Singal, has done a lot of good reporting on looking at did the implicit bias test, did implementing all these things actually lead to a less racially hostile workplace or workforce or whatever it is? And the answer looks to be from the data, often not.
Yeah, it's about protecting the companies.
Yeah. We'll have more Rising right after this. Stay with us.